But really, all that you need to start it is to have one person in your department who can communicate well with their peers, can hold on to information that they know is very personal and very private, and to have some sense of connection to the outside world and what's available to those folks for assistance.
Thank you for tuning in to the Critical Conversations podcast, brought to you by Mind the Frontline. Established in 2023 as a 501c3, Mind the Frontline is your ally in the journey to support those who selflessly safeguard our communities. Their core mission revolves around pioneering innovation and research, education, and overall well-being specifically tailored to healthcare, military, and public service frontline first responders. The Critical Conversation podcast is a dedicated space for police, fire, EMS, allied health workers, dispatchers, air medical, and military personnel, along with their families. Here, we dive into the heart of the matter, tackling essential topics such as mental health strategies, recovery methods, treatment options, the latest research, and professional development opportunities. Before we dive into today's episode on Critical Conversations, we do want to, however, acknowledge the nature of our discussions. Some of the content discussed may be triggering or intense as we explore the challenges and the triumphs within the first responder community. We recognize that these discussions may evoke strong emotions or memories. If you or someone you know is struggling and needs immediate support, we urge you to reach out to your agency's mental health resources or your local peer support group. In time of mental health crisis, you can always contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by phone or via text at 988. Please remember, you are never alone and help is always available. At Mind the Frontline, we are more than just a podcast. We are a community committed to fostering resilience within the entire first responder family. So whether you're on the front lines or supporting those who are, we invite you to subscribe, engage, and be a part of this vital mission. To learn more, please visit us at www.mindthefrontline.org. Now let's dive into today's critical conversation. First responders, listeners, and Mind the Frontline members, welcome back to the Critical Conversations podcast, brought to you by Mind the Frontline. Today, I'm really honored to have a guest speaker who brings knowledge and experience to our ongoing mission of fostering resilience within the first responder community as we discuss the considerations for developing a peer support program. Our guest today is Dan Cohen with Williamson County EMS. Dan has been in journalism. He's been working with Williamson County EMS for over 19 years. He's worked on an ambulance for the last 9.5 years, and currently he's the clinical practices captain for Williamson County EMS. He creates CEs for first responders, and Dan's kind of niche is blending photography and paramedicine to tell the story of basically Williamson County EMS in Texas. Now he's working towards his master's degree of clinical mental health counseling, and with the goal of providing services to first responders and other healthcare workers. You know, his experience in this field, his experience in EMS in Texas, he's kind of been known as a pillar around Texas, if you've talked to any of the clinical educators that I know anyways in my circle. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Welcome, Dan. Thank you very much for joining us today on the Critical Conversations podcast.
Howdy, Chris. That is one heck of an introduction, and I am very honored to be here with you as well to talk about some very important subjects in mental health, and not only what we're trying to do in EMS, but how peer support is really changing people's lives and ability to stay effective within jobs that they love to do across all different kinds of workforces.
Yeah, we're seeing, the growth of, we're definitely seeing the growth of peer support, within the public safety realms, whether you're an EMS, if you're in fire, if you're working in a hospital or a facility, a police officer, dispatcher, all of that, you're seeing the incidents and more agencies kind of growing internal peer support. So it's really nice to have a discussion, especially with someone I consider, very knowledgeable in this subject, because this is something that, while I've utilized peer support, I have no really, sound experience in actually creating a peer support program. So having an expert like you on the show is definitely, welcomed. And I really look forward to the discussion. Is there a reason, when you submitted the peer or the speaker registration that, what drew you to kind of peer support in this topic? Why is it so passionate for you?
I, I think that anyone who has worked in public safety for a long enough period of time has either struggled with their own mental health challenges or they have friends and coworkers who have struggled. And I know too many people in emergency medical services, in our partner fire departments, and some of our law enforcement partners where those folks left jobs that they loved at a time that was not of their choosing. And so the thing that has always come up was the fact that people just didn't feel like they could reach out for help. And the value of peer support, not just to us, but really anybody in any industry, is the fact that peer support can provide that bridge. It's as simple as two trusted friends or coworkers being able to have a conversation that leads the person who is in distress to believe that if they reach out for help, they are not going to be stigmatized for doing so. Um, and sometimes that is all that's needed to let people know that what they're experiencing is something that should not make them feel alone. That many of us, many of their peers have been there before, and reaching out for help um, uh, with the assistance of peer support, I think, is something that's becoming expected. And I will tell you, I'm not an expert on peer support, although I appreciate the endorsement. I'm extremely, I'm a major proponent of it. It's something that I've talked with a lot of people about, and and I will say I have seen peer support grow dramatically in the same way that a decade ago everybody decided that community health, paramedicine, and things of that nature were important for EMS departments. I've seen peer support grow in a very similar manner over that same time, as unfortunately suicides and distressful events have increased, that a lot of our peers have been challenge to deal with, particularly with the onset of COVID.
I like how you use the word, breaking the stigma and really just two people having a really honest conversation, an open, vulnerable, transparent conversation, because I'm seeing that more and more agencies, whether fire, EMS, police, law enforcement, dispatching centers, they're really taking root of understanding that these people are human. And I think we're really starting to understand that even as first responders, we have feelings and emotions as well. And knowing what to do with those emotions, how to, process some of those emotions and things like that can be very difficult, especially if you were never given the tools, resiliency training, or any of the education, which I never received any in any of my 23 years of EMS experience. And so I think understanding the need, why peer support programs matter in a high stress profession such as first responders, public safety, what are some of those, needs that we see with peer support, and why does it matter so much?
Sure, and maybe I can start by talking a little bit about what makes first responders a little bit different, and it's something that I
Absolutely.
think we all gravitate toward this idea that that what the public sees on TV is pretty darn far from what our actual jobs and experiences are. And maybe you can think about it this way. Imagine that you're a barista at a large national chain of coffee shops, and one of your customers uh, tells you that you're an idiot and you shouldn't be working there because you got their order wrong, and now you're upset and you're depressed. Or maybe and you decide that you'd like to talk to their peer support in their organization, because frankly peer support is kind of getting everywhere these days.
It
Or
is.
let's say that you're in a law firm and you deal with real estate law, and you just lost a case, and you find it depressing because maybe you're not practicing the kind of law that you wanted to, and so now you're depressed. Or let's imagine that a you're a paramedic on an ambulance, and you run a call with on a child with a life-threatening traumatic injury, and that child dies, and they just happen to be wearing the same T-shirt as your child that you dropped off at school just 2 hours before you showed up for your shift. And you kind of compare those things and think about them. Everybody's worst day or distress is kind of their own, but the distresses that first responders are expected to take in stride, or at least when I started in this line of work almost 20 years ago, the suck it up buttercup was not a Williamson County EMS thing. That was really the expectation of us as first responders, that part of the job was managing that, and you tell a little joke about what you need to and you move on. And I think when we put ourselves in that category, we realize that not only are first responders at greater risk for anxiety and depression, just like the example of, the two very different workforces I mentioned previously, but we're also at great risk for things like PTSD. And unfortunately, with PTSD, there's also a very strong correlation with substance use disorders. And particularly for folks in the military, they found that was alcohol. So to the tune of nearly 80% in some research, PTSD comes along with alcoholism. And we can't necessarily extrapolate exactly an 80% or an exact number for first responders. But when we look at PTSD numbers for first responders, they are pretty similar to those in the military. Lifetime rates are supposedly around 30% for members of the military, and it's not much different for first responders in general. And that's approximately 3 times the rate amongst members of the general public. And so those risks, those diagnoses, if you don't get some sort of help for that, you're not going to fare well. And peer support for so many people is the door, is the thing that opens the door to some sort of higher level of care. And without peer support, it's kind of the equivalent of, say, we identify a STEMI or a heart attack on a 12-lead EKG, and then we just decide not to take them to a cardiac cath lab. We just skip
Take them to an urgent care.
Right? You take them to an urgent care, and that's what, to me, what peer support is very much all about. It's about helping to direct the people we work with, that we love, our work families, people we care about, that we work with, and getting them to the right care, just like we would for our patients.
I think that's a great, kind of analogy. I loved your barista versus the lawyer, and really kind of highlighting the difference of professions and industries at the same time. I do think when it comes to first responders, in our instance of our type of PTSD, traumatic PTSD, and traumatic events, it does differ from the general population. And in history's past, we've always kind of treated PTSD, at least in the DSM-5, it kind of applies to everybody. It's a blanket, it's not just specific to first responders or the general public. But I wholly feel like the PTSD and what we go through and the traumatic experiences that we experience, are significantly greater than, the general public. Your examples of a barista getting berated, a lawyer, losing his case, those are stressful. They, bring in a lot of stress. But when you compare that to the paramedic who just dropped off his kid and 2 hours later is dealing with a sentinel event with a event that reminds him of his own child, that really brings a lot of energy. And we also know that, like, a lot of first responders are empathic, and we tend to own a lot of energy because we want to be of service. We want to make a difference. We want to
Mhm.
save a life. And when we're not able to do that, it really becomes difficult sometimes to process
Mhm.
that. So having the resources to reach out and talk absolutely helps from the post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSS, from transitioning over to a long-term, more debilitating PTSD. When you look at
Mhm.
JEMS, in a recent article that they published, 37% of EMS providers reported symptoms consistent with PTSD. So that's saying, like,
Yep.
1/3 of our workforce is actively, in a long-term kind of mental health struggle right now. And we only see those numbers continuing to rise, sometimes more drastically than others, especially in other industries. When you compare, if I was to compare first responders and the incidence of PTSD to, say, construction workers or, office workers, it is significantly different. I think it's important to understand those differences and the importance of having a peer support, not only in just in first responders, but yet you're right, we are seeing it grow in other, industries at the same time. So going back to kind of the original, I mean, why do we think these matter? When it comes to first agencies, why do you see more and more agencies really kind of starting to adapt this? Because I'm kind of like you. I'm not. I've been in EMS for 23 years. It hasn't kind of changed in 23 years. It's only kind of been in the last 5 that I've kind of seen mental health, peer support, resiliency training really kind of starting to come to the forefront. So why are we kind of grasping onto this right now, which is great. I think it's needed more than ever. But what are you seeing?
So I I'll disagree with you just a little bit in that, and I appreciate your experience and your years in service. But we've been really fortunate here in Williamson County. I wish that we had been doing some element of peer support for the 19 plus years that I've been here. But I first had the opportunity to speak on peer support and what we were doing here. I believe it was 7 or 8 years ago at a conference, at an EMS World Conference, I believe. And so I certainly wasn't the first person to think of it or to do it within a department. It's something that we recognize from our own internal struggles and some of the difficult things that we experienced here. Um, but I think that over time there are things that become more of a norm, right? I don't know too many decent sized EMS agencies, even a bunch of small ones that don't have some sort of community health paramedicine program or medic program. Uh, Pretty much everybody uses an electronic PCR at this point, and I think that peer support is one of those things that doesn't necessarily, in its purest form, really require any money, and that's really what we run up against so often uh, in EMS systems, particularly those that are volunteer or that struggle with more limited budgets than a department like mine is blessed with. And so I'm hopeful that there are more departments that have them, peer support teams, than that don't have them. And from what I've seen, the concentration in the media, the just general public media talking about uh, suicides and mental health issues within our profession, many of which were brought even more to light during COVID. I think that our trade publications about EMS and really having a good crossover conversation with other first responder uh, partners that we have, fire departments, police departments, and with the military, I think have been really enlightening and have shown us that this is something that is not, it does take some organization, but it doesn't necessarily have to be costly. And it's certainly cheaper than having if you just want to look at it from a monetary standpoint, which is not humanistic in
Yeah.
any way, but when governments think about things, they're often thinking about it with a dollar sign. And some administrators, not so much mine, but some in our industry are forced to do that. Uh, it's it's cheaper to hire people and ensure that they are healthy enough mentally and physically to continue to do a job that they've been trained to do at that agency, as opposed to uh, basically run them over with your system and then pay
And
to
lose that
train and replace
resource.
them. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
we are
Longevity.
resources that are finite.
We are.
Yeah,
Yeah. We're finite
yeah,
resources,
yeah.
and numbers from in our EMT show that, with the decline of EMTs and paramedics, exiting the profession, because
Mhm.
of a lot of mental health and all the stuff that comes with that, stress, long hours, burnout, not being appreciated, underpaid. And so, if we don't start taking care of and fostering, peer support programs and providing these individuals with purpose and a way to really kind of, extend their, and let's talk about it in like a little bit of a business sense. What's your customer lifetime value? Well, what's your employees lifetime value? You could get, a young EMS. I came in at 18 years old, 20 years, that would be something I would expect for someone that would come into public safety. That's kind of what we strive to, hitting our pension, our 20-year benefits, but we're seeing less and less that people are making that 20-year mark. And I do think
Mhm.
that the industry and administrators are realizing that it's a little bit, little less costly if you just invest a little time and energy into a peer support program
Mhm.
versus actually losing that personnel. And when we lose these people, they don't come back to EMS. They move on and go into another industry or another profession. And so you're right, we lose that finite resource. So in saying that, what are some ideas as far as, if I was an organization and say I do not have this, but I'm looking into it, what are some key components that you would identify to be successful for a peer support program?
Sure. I think that there's a number of things that any agency would want to look at, and um, I think there are a few basic things that apply to everybody, and there are some things that are unique to different regions. So let's start with the things that I think are probably important for everyone. And I'm not going off of research for this. I'm going off of some of the experiences that we had and some things that I would imagine would be highly detrimental to any peer support program. So first of all, you need to have the support of the top end of your organization. If you don't have that, then it's going to be problematic. And like we just talked about, we are a finite resource. I don't work in the field anymore, so I'm not so much a finite resource. But the
Neither
people
am I.
who but the people who do the real work out there in the field, they are the finite resource. And if we want to maintain them, we have to care for them. So I think that's really the thing for administrators that can help get them on board if they have doubts. Um, Aside from that, you need to have an administration that is willing to provide a level of autonomy for a peer support team. They need to be within a certain set of parameters allowed to function, kind of like our field medics are functioning with standards of care in the field. Um, they need to have a group of people who are chosen for their ability to communicate with others, uh, the way in which they care for others, and maybe more important than anything else, the ability to keep their mouth shut. So it's
I
kind of
think you
like
hit one of those
it's kind
key
of like
points right there is anonymity, right? Like trying to make sure that we're not getting the story out. We have to remain confidentiality, I think, for any peer support
Mhm.
program to be successful has to be at the first and foremost, right behind administrative support. You're right. Because if you don't get
Sure.
buy-in from up top, it's going to be an uphill battle.
Sure, and there's of course a couple of caveats. If somebody is actively going to hurt themselves or somebody else, they're going to endanger a patient. There are certain things where secrecy goes out. At least some secrecy goes out the window where somebody has to be informed. But that's something that we make clear to the members of our peer support team, as well as the folks who have signed up to receive peer support contact. And of course, that's optional. And that brings me to another point. Peer support needs to be optional. It's something that all of our employees can opt into or out of at any time. And so
And why
that's
is
very
that, Dan? That's a
important.
very important topic, I think, to kind of break down a little bit. Why do you? And I think it's a great idea, so I'm not disagreeing by any means. But for our listeners and viewers, can you kind of break down why it's important that this is an opt-in program and not forced?
Sure. It's one thing to be told, hey, you need help, um, and not really be a person who is interested in responding to the type of assistance that's being offered. Um, we don't ever want peer support to be a nuisance for somebody. I see peer support more as an open door that somebody will hold out a hand and someone can take that hand. But if that's something they don't want, a checkup on a regular basis after a certain type of call, then that's their business. They don't have to reach out and get that hand. Additionally, we're not. Um, our peer support team is not really in an administrative chain in terms of having to respond from someone in the field and then discuss that with someone in admin. In fact, that'd be a no-no, right? So
Agreed.
we don't ever want to be in that realm of having to be in a having to be in a chain of command where someone might be, say, punished for not accepting assistance. That would really kind of take a lot of the value and potential trust away from people in the field uh, who might really need to talk to somebody the most, yet feel uh, uh, at most risk of stigma from having that become an exhibit A for an administrator to see. Even if you do have a great admin and people are generally getting along from field to admin, which thankfully right now we're having that experience.
That's always good.
But
That's a positive
that is
organization
always good.
culture.
It hasn't always been that way. We've had good times and hard times in 19 years, but that's a really important thing to keep those things separate and keep people accessing peer support when and if they want to. And when you think about stages of change that people are in, I think people who are receptive to peer support they are in some stage where they are ready to accept some new information. And there are others who aren't. And if they aren't, then that's not necessarily something that we should try to bring them to kicking and screaming.
I agree. It's kind of like you can lead a horse to water, but I can't force the horse to drink. You want to
Yeah.
make it a resource, make sure it's known, make sure all the employees know that this is a safe space, and confidentiality is key, because I think trust and obviously the fear of repercussions. I mean, that's always at the forefront of a lot of individuals' minds when they think about peer support. It's like, am I going to get in trouble? Is there any fear to this? Am I going to lose
Mhm.
my job? Am I going to get suspended? Is admin going to find out? So I think you hit on a lot of good
Right.
key points for some of those frameworks. Anything else you'd want to add as far as, these are key components versus these are more regional components?
Sure. Some other key components that I think are valuable is to have a, and again, this is just on the internal side of things, to have a series of call types or issues that will auto generate a need to contact somebody. So, for example, in my department, we have a list of call types like uh, a death in the field, a serious traumatic injury to a child, sexual assault, um, serious violence or murder, um, those types of things. The death of someone or serious injury of someone that you work with, or could be a law enforcement official, somebody that you work with in the field and relate to. Any of those call type examples will generate a a request to the peer support team, and someone will see the crew members that were involved and will volunteer to respond based on their availability or perhaps their the initial rapport that they might have with members of that crew. And I think that's an important thing when we think about not just the issue with one call as one traumatic event, but in terms of giving people the opportunity to interrupt that death from a thousand cuts, where they have
Yeah.
the opportunity to go, you know what? It wasn't this one thing. It's all this. It's the culmination of all these things. And I think that is something that gets as many of our folks in this profession, if not more, than a singular traumatic event. And
Yeah, the
so I
death by
think
a
that's
thousand
important.
cuts I can definitely relate to
Yeah.
in my own struggles.
Yeah.
So, and it's nice because it gives you multiple opportunities to kind of make a touch. And I do think it's important to have triggers, that trigger. Once again, you have a foundation, you have, key components, but when do you react? And so I like how you
Mhm.
guys have kind of outlined that. That's really cool.
Yeah. So some of what I mentioned before were really about internal things in building a peer support program. Some of the things that we've done and tried. There are some external things that are equally important. The first and foremost, I would say, is to have a bank of resources that is set up and ready to go. And in some places, that might be something that gets pieced together based on what's there. In a rural area, you may have a different situation from ours. Where Williamson County is one county north of Travis County, which is where Austin, Texas is. So there's a 500,000 plus people in this county and a whole lot more in the next one down. So we have a lot of resources. Um, and we use Tanya Glenn and associates, and I believe you mentioned that you had visited with her on a separate podcast. But her
I have.
organization specializes in working with first responders and folks in the military. So her organization actually provides the equivalent of explain this in medic ease would would be to say that she's kind of like our medical director for peer support, if you want to think about it that way. So whenever for example, when a notification comes up that says medic so and so and their crew members saw this uh, homicide that they dealt with, um, Tanya or a member of her team sees all of those things. If there's any communication or any issue that requires her or her folks to be more present, then they see that, and that's something that they can accommodate. So they're always kind of over our shoulder in a really good way. Additionally, they are there to help provide us with education for our peer support team. And I would say to people who don't necessarily have a Tanya Glenn and Associates, um, reach out to the mental. If there's a local mental health authority in their area, in their county, in the corner of the state where they happen to reside, to reach out to them, establish those partnerships, because a lot of those local mental health authorities, they run on grants, and you never know what they've got grants to spend money on. It might be education for your peer support team or some sort of way to help you do that. And then the last thing I'd say in terms of external support is to look at some of the technology that is out there. And we haven't implemented this, but we're looking at some different options for applications that would tie into either our EPCR our reporting system and or our CAD system, which would allow some of those things to automate a little bit. We
Yeah.
definitely would not want to automate the conversations that we have with people. I don't think AI peer support is going to be a good thing. It scares the hell out of me, actually. And it's
It
not just the
does.
gray hair
I, I've
talking.
s-
Yeah,
I've seen some of those already pop up as far as,
yeah.
AI, peer
Hmm.
support chat bots and things like that. And it kind of does
Right.
scare me when it comes to that. But I do think it's important to establish early relationships with whatever those providers are and resources within your city, your agency, your responding, district, because when it happens, you want to have and be prepared and have those
Hmm.
established relationships, so, maybe they don't have access to the Tanya Glenn and Associates of the world. Maybe they're in a little small
Hmm.
town in Southern Arizona, but there are resources that you can find that maybe within your own community, but also, don't weigh out remote, for example, I used to work at a small department called Rio Rico down, south of Tucson. Probably not
Hmm.
going to have any good resources. However, Tucson is only an hour away and there are resources up there. And, there's always the ability to remote. So I never want to shut the remote possibility down. It's more or less just establishing, those processes and establishing those relationships ahead of time. So when it happens and you need to lean on it, there's a process in place and a foundation in place.
Well, I want to mention something that you honed in on there, which is remote, and I want to separate that from AI. It's obviously those two things are different because of COVID. The growth of mental health care, in fact, many modes of healthcare, has expanded dramatically into into the streaming world of things, and there's a fair amount of research out there already that's indicative of, particularly with counseling, where
Mhm.
having doing it via telehealth is not necessarily any different in terms of efficacy over time. And I can speak from personal experience. My wife and I did some did some marriage counseling during COVID, and we used uh,
Remote.
we did that via telehealth because that was the option. We had begun that just prior to COVID, but we continued it during COVID. And I got to say, it was hugely beneficial. But the research that's out there is really saying the same thing. And part of the counseling program that I'm learning from definitely is espousing that same aspect. So for those of us who are really concerned about a stigma for what we're doing, having that option to not even have to leave our home.
Hmm.
If you're worried that, oh my God, somebody might see me and think something about me in my community or have a certain thought, I would hope that those are things that no one would put that on your shoulders as someone needing help. But that's where our minds go sometimes
They
when
do.
when we're not ourselves, we're not when we're not okay. And so
And
having that as an option is immense. And when you talk about rural fire districts or EMS services, rural law enforcement agencies, all of that I think becomes that much more valuable.
I couldn't say that any better, Dan. I personally have used, and I still do use, remote counseling services because sometimes I'm busy, sometimes I just can't get there. And
Mhm.
I think you hit on a good point because a lot of people, I know other agencies and other departments, they do have like maybe a localized peer support, resource or their own, peer support thing. And there is the stigma and the fear. Once again, our minds go to just weird places sometimes and they start imagining things like, oh, well, if I go here and someone sees me, they're going to think that I have a problem. And I don't want the world to know that I have a problem. And so,
Mhm.
yes, I think when you talk about remote, resources, those are invaluable more than ever. And it's really good to see that the studies have shown that whether you're in person or doing this remote, the efficacy of the treatment is the same. And so I think people need to grasp onto that. So, having a hybrid model even could be a very beneficial for your peer support program. So they have the option of, hey, do you
Yeah.
want to do this remote or do you want to do this in person? Because some people do want to do it in person, and some people just like, hey, maybe for the first couple of times we just do this remote and I can kind of maybe see how it is. And they warm up to, it's like kind of like dipping your toe in that nice warm water, or hopefully it's not cold. But you want to get used to it before they jump all the way in. And sometimes, individuals just need that buy-in to let the program and the process and the time work itself out. So I love that.
And whether,
Now,
and
go
whether
ahead.
and whether you're talking about peer support or counseling, um, pretty much with counseling, the thing, and this may not come as a surprise, but there are probably 20 different counseling theories that are pretty commonly used by counselors with their clients. But there's over 400 counseling theories out there, some of which are probably total nonsense and some are probably great. But the reality is the biggest single thing that impacts success is the rapport between the counselor and the client. And admittedly, peer support people are not counselors. However, they are entering into a role where there is a potential for uh, definitely a layperson's discussion that borders on helping to get people towards some good advice if that's what they need, or just to listen and not advise at all. But
It's a
that
good
the
bridge. It's
rapport,
a good
the
bridge.
yeah, the rapport factor is exactly the same, and I think that's really the value. It's the fact that you're talking with another human that's actually empathetic towards whatever it is that you're struggling with.
I like that. And it kind of goes to the next topic I want to kind of bring up, is called, kind of breaking the stigma. When we have, or if there are individuals out there, whether they're on the front line, they're administrators, or they have a peer support program, or they don't have a peer support program, how do we foster a culture of mental health support in first responder communities? How do we continue to push this so we can let others know that this is okay. It's becoming the norm, right? It's just like,
Mm-hmm.
I have to go in for an annual physical, if I get injured, I have to go follow up, we get injured in our brain. It's a silent injury sometimes. And we don't necessarily see that. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but stigma from a lot of people that I talk to is a big barrier for them seeking help, seeking, the resources, because they don't want to have that stigma kind of pushed on them.
Sure. So a lot of what uh, Dr. Glenn Tanya has shared with her education of our peer support team, and a lot of the materials that she creates are all about the stigma of getting help and reducing that, and uh, and that's really uh, what peer support is all about. Um, Sorry, you're gonna have to cut this. I got to stretch.
That's fine.
Sorry, you got to edit this part and then ask me the question one more time.
Totally fine. So moving into the next part and this kind of next topic, it's really just kind of looking at, breaking down the stigmas. We know that a lot of people are fearful. We know that, that's the first thing that comes to their mind, when they start thinking like, okay, I feel like I might be off and I might need help. Usually, for me, anyways, early on, the next thought was, okay, well, I have a fear of talking to my peer support group or talking to my department or talking to anybody because I don't want to get labeled. I don't want to, and it's not even just being labeled, but it's just the fear of everything else. Like we already talked about, a fear of someone else discovering that I went into the peer support group or I went into the peer support resource for my department and they saw me. What does the community think about me? What does my fellow coworker think about me? These stigmas can be very pervasive in high stress professions. And, so I guess I'm asking, how can we as first responders, or how can we, really foster a culture that supports the mental health support and really supports that it's okay to get peer support and activate it and reach out and, should it speak to you?
I Interestingly, I think that the biggest thing that is occurring outside of folks like Dr. Tanya Glenn, who a lot of their materials is all about talking about that stigma. And if we talk about it and stories about people like us who have reached out for assistance, that will reduce the stigma over time. I think that's extremely helpful. But there is one massive change that has been going on for my 19 years in this profession, and that's the fact that uh, I'm getting grayer and they're younger. And
Yeah.
as people come into this department, the younger people who come in here, for the most part, seem to have very different expectations for themselves in terms of their level of happiness, what job satisfaction means to them. Um, and so I have found a great many of them to be a lot more open to discussing mental health. Many of them will bring up those questions first. Um, I I know there's somebody that I've been sorry about that. There's somebody that I have been a mentor to who runs a certain kind of call, and then will ask me, "Hey, is it normal for me to feel like this?" Or to be thinking about this certain thing about this call. That was not a discussion that anybody I knew had 15, 20 years ago. It
I'm
just
with you.
wasn't a discussion.
Yeah.
It wasn't a thing. And now it's a thing. So the fact that so many of these younger EMTs, AEMTs, paramedics are willing to let that cat out of the bag first, they're
Be
bringing it to our
transparent, be
attention.
vulnerable.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Generational. I think it's generational changes, right? We're
Mhm.
seeing these younger people coming in because they have an expectation of good work-life balance, not being stressed, and these are
Mhm.
just things that we're seeing change in our culture overall, and it's
Mhm.
forcing. Uh, first responders and public safety agencies across the board to adapt to that because you're having a change of kind of guard, so to speak. And I think it's these new kind of modern leaders that I kind of speak to that, you're a gray hair, but Dan, you're setting an example for those that are following you. And these younger generations are more apt and more open to it. So I do think we are going to see the progression and the breaking down of the stigma kind of accelerate over the next couple of years. I really do, because we're moving people out that kind of are rooted in tradition and not change and not flexible. But we're also seeing a new younger generation that is coming in, and they are holding their administration and leadership accountable, or they're leaving. And
Mhm.
so it's
Yeah.
either the leadership needs to adapt to it, or they're, I'm sorry, you're a business, right? So if you don't have your finite resources, you can't do your function. You can't create
Mhm.
revenue. So you
Oh
do
yeah.
need to think about it as a business decision of, okay, if I don't change, if I don't adapt to the changing environment of, public health and mental health and public safety, you know, you're going to get left by the wayside. You're going to have trouble finding people to
Yeah.
hire.
It's
Your turnover
yeah.
rate's going to be extremely, extremely high, and that is going to affect your bottom line and your viability as an agency.
And we're not, and EMS is not unique in that. The things that so many companies out there are doing right now to retain, particularly their younger workers, seems rather extraordinary to some of us. But like we talked about earlier, it can cost a heck of a lot more to lose that person that you've trained, have to rehire somebody and get their buy-in on what it is that your organization does. So it is incredibly important that that we are open to that. And 19 years ago, we would have told stories about, hey, I ran this call and this is how it was, to sort of see what the new person's reaction might be to that, to maybe kind of gauge how
Shock
they
and
would
awe.
deal with, yeah, how they would deal with something. And maybe uh, perhaps some people would judge them based on what their reaction was. Would they be able to handle things when they got really difficult mentally? And nowadays, we don't do that. We give them scenarios so that they're prepared for it, but we discuss, hey, we're just going to tell you, when you run this kind of call, you may feel like this, but
And
that's
that's
normal.
normal.
And then we're going to talk about what that means to your sympathetic nervous system and to your ability to sleep and the things that you need to do to be resilient.
I love that. And then when you do look at other industries, Google, tech, things like that, they are doing extraordinary things that I think people within our industry would be like, they would be totally taken aback. But man, they really
Mhm.
do invest. They think about, just the environment, from thinking about, for more progressive agencies, how they set up their stations, right? Making sure that they're fostering, a collective, culture that is, it has nice lighting. It's nice to be there. Brings down the stress levels and things like that. So we are seeing outside industries, and hopefully some spillover because we can learn from other industries. And I think we should, because what works for them, if it helps us, by all means, we need to borrow it, especially now more than ever, so we can get these suicide rates down. And not only that, we need to start bolstering our finite resources, because public health is only going to continue to grow, and the need and the demand on the public health and EMS and public safety resources is going to continue to grow. And so we need to make sure that we have these resources, and once we invest in them, that we don't lose them within 5 years, that we're going to be able to
Mhm.
utilize these resources within our communities for 10, 15, 20 plus years and see them through the retirement. You're not seeing so many people go full send anymore to hit their 20 or their, in some cases 30 for some areas. So I think it's really good to see that we're adapting, which is great, because that's exactly what we need to do. When it comes to the training and preparedness for peer support, what do we need to do to equip our peer supporters on the front lines of mental health? Is there any required training, any specific standards?
Mhm.
What is the training that goes into a peer supporter, so to speak, an individual?
Sure. And again, I think that it's some things are probably valuable for anybody who wants to assist their peers with mental health issues and resilience. And there are also some things that are specific to your agency, your specific location. In our uh, peer support environment, uh, like I said, we have Tanya Glenn and her agency who has been able to come in and provide specialized education that they provide to all of the agencies that they provide peer support supervision for. So they kind of have a rolled out plan of what that looks like. And for them, that includes a description of, of how stress works, how stress and trauma works on our brain, on our nervous system, and and some of the diagnoses that come along with that, some of the stigmas involved, the some of the workable treatments for people, and so I think that that's things that kind of cover those aspects of explaining the background of why people feel like they do when they encounter these traumatic events and they're not ready or able to process them. It's important for us to know that, and especially in as EMS people, we can have that conversation about the sympathetic nervous system and the adrenal cortex and all of those things, and present it in a way to them that is very logical, and for most medics should have a basis of understanding of that, and that really roots it in something that is less about, hey, I'm special, I'm the only one who's ever felt this way, I must be crazy, to, oh my gosh, I'm experiencing what most people might experience in this situation. So I think that level of education is important. I think another thing that has been really good for us that we've done, we have provided mental health first aid education for all of our peer support providers. And mental health first aid, along with psychological first aid, there are kind of some different versions of it floating around, but the gist of it is all kind of the same. It's how do we help our peers when they are suffering with a mental health issue. So it's really pretty ideal. How do we triage things? How do we decide uh, not only how to we might communicate with this person, but how to get them to help and what's the right kind of help? And so having those trainings is has been really good for us. And then one thing that we're going to do for our entire staff in the coming months, which we have never done, is we've had an offer from our local mental health authority to provide mental health first aid training for our entire field staff, which is really amazing. I don't know that I've never heard of an EMS agency training all of their staff on mental health first aid. So I don't have any data on who's doing it and who isn't. I just know I've never heard of anybody doing it. Um, and I think
I've
that
heard
that
more
will
and more
provide
doing
not
it.
only well, I'm glad to hear that because it
Yeah.
will provide not only a basis to assist their peers and recognize things, but it will also help them with the behavioral health calls that they run and help to communicate better and maybe understand some of their patients a little bit better. So I'm really
I think
excited
that's
that that's
great.
something we're doing. Yeah.
I think that is great. And I think it's very, very sorely needed. And it's great to see that you guys are doing this. One of my good friends, Alexander Jeber from Emergency Resilience, she has an emergency
Mhm.
resilience course. And I know a lot of the agencies, when I owned IA Med, if they were part of our agency solutions, they all got that course and it was phenomenal. It definitely
Yeah.
allows individuals to, and I like how you put that, we get to better relate to those patients because I can recall so many patients that I've taken with behavioral health and mental health issues that I just didn't understand. I was just simply like, why are you like this? And I just didn't have that understanding, and now I'm able to have a little bit more understanding, be a little bit more empathetic. It really has changed my clinical practice and how I approach and even initiate those first initial steps with a patient like that because I have the training and understanding. If you don't have the tools and you don't know how to use the tools,
Mhm.
you can't be successful in building something, and so I think arming your staff with those tools for all the frontline staff is a phenomenal idea. And I do think more and more of this needs to spill throughout our industry. I would even go so far as to, ask the NREMT and the National Association of EMS Educators to start incorporating, resiliency training, and things like this in initial EMS education and making it a requirement to maintain that. Just like I have to have so many hours of airway and so many hours of operation, I should have so many hours required by these national bodies every time I go to recertify for mental health and wellness. Because once again, it's not just one thing that's going to save this. It's taking a multi-pronged approach. But I do like that how you guys have been proactive and are rolling this out to your staff because speaking at least from my experience, once I was armed with that education and those tools and resources, it made it easier for me to identify that in my other staff. And it made it easier for me to open up those lines of communication with someone else who might be struggling. Because up
Mhm.
until then, I didn't have those resources. I didn't have those tools. I didn't know what the signs to look at. I didn't even know how to take care of myself, let alone try to manage or look out for signs and symptoms of other people. And so I really love that you guys are doing that with your training and preparedness objectives. Um, when you talk about the training and preparedness and implementing a peer support program, Dan, what are some challenges that you think are more common for individuals or agencies to run into? Because I always like to share, yes, this is how a perfect, peer support program works, but we all know that there's going to be challenges along the way. What are some challenges you think, one from the agency side and another from the individual side?
Sure. From the agency side, I think perhaps the biggest potential issue could be uh, leadership at the agency not really understanding what the purpose of peer support is and maybe not having a due regard for the exceptional need for that wall between peer support and administration. I think that would be a significant risk. Luckily, that's not one that we've faced here. I've never had a challenge from anyone above my rank asking me, or of equal rank asking me if asking me questions related to somebody's uh, whether or not somebody had peer support or anything like that. It's just something that's not discussed. Every once in a while, they might ask and say, "Hey, would you mind reaching out to so and so?" But what might happen
That's good.
after that, there's nothing. Hey, do you mind? I was a little worried about so and so. Would one of y'all mind reaching out to them? That's happened a number of times, but of course, we're not going to tell that administrator anything about it. So
Yeah, there's no follow up, but it's really good to see that,
no, yeah,
higher up leadership is
yeah,
they're obviously they're being, being present because they're checking in and being
yeah.
aware of what's going on with their employees, which
Yeah.
is always a good sign of good leadership and good organizational culture. And so I do love that. Was it something for the administration, when you really started to latch on and grasp onto the peer support idea and really foster it within and grow it within Williamson County EMS? Was it something that just came to them? Was it something that they sought out? How did that discussion or that seed get planted? Because obviously for our listeners out here, they might want to plant their seed or this seed in their own leadership.
So I think one of the first things that you and I talked about in this podcast was the reason that we started or peer support in the first place, and why I was interested in it. Um, and that really came down to those people that we worked with and cared about who left left the profession at a time that was not of their choosing, and that's all that I'll say. But luckily, people none of those people died, but they really needed help, and they didn't have any sort of anybody to open that door and kind of hold their hand and get them to that assistance. Um, and to not even have that as an option, whether they would have participated or accepted that, we don't know. But it wasn't part of our culture. And if you don't have it as part of your stated culture of who you want to be as an organization and the members within it, then it's something that will just receive lip service. And so the departure of those folks brought really was what helped to motivate us. And you mentioned the word perfect system, and ours certainly isn't that. But we were talking about things that would be really tough for a peer support group, and that's the fact that peer support groups should not hold themselves responsible when something bad happens, because unfortunately it does. We had a suicide in our department a few years back, and it was something that shocked all of us, as suicides frequently do. Um, and that was something that I think if you got hung up on and thought, "Oh my gosh, this is something that we should have prevented, and we couldn't prevent it, and therefore we're not an important thing or entity." I think that that's a risk, because, like as paramedics, we all know there are people we're not going to save. There are people that nobody's going to die in the back of my ambulance is nonsense, because every once in a while somebody's going to die in the back of your ambulance, and that's something that as peer support people, it's a lot harder to come around to that when it's your coworkers, your friends, people you've run calls with and shared good times and bad. That can be a tough one. So finding ways to process that is really important, because you're not going to be you're not going to be able to help everyone either get to help or get help that gets them through. So that can be a difficult thing.
I think that was a very important point, Dan. I'm really glad that you shared that because, I struggled with that early on when I really started kind of, uh, kind of going down my pathway of really kind of supporting mental health and kind of becoming somewhat of an advocate for mental health and first responders, I would have people reach out all the time, and it's still a couple of calls that still stick with me where, despite my best efforts and what I tried to do, that individual succumbed to their disease and their bad times, and it really is unfortunate, and that is something that I have worked through with my counselor. But having to understand that, it's not, I can't own that. I can't take that on. That's not on me. It's not on the peer support team. Inevitably things are not going to go the way that we plan. A good plan is just that. It's a plan. We know that as peer support members that we try to support, we try to guide. I try to provide resources and say, hey, and share my own experience. So that way, hopefully, uh, uh, provide some sort of trust, and we can build that. But at the same time, ultimately, it is that individual's decision whether they want to get help or not. And we're not going to
Mhm.
save everybody. Early on, that was definitely my mentality, Dan. Nobody dies in the back of my aircraft. Nobody dies in the back of my ambulance. Nobody dies inside the house fire. That is all just machismo and ego that ends up kind of sabotaging us down the road. So I like how you kind of put that as, there are going to be, bad outcomes to peer support, instances. And it's not the peer support team. It's not the peer support program. It's what it is. It's just like when we say, feeling emotions after a traumatic event is normal. Unfortunately, that is normal. It's part of life. It's part of the statistics. We what we can do is strive to get that number as high as we can as far as those we can impact. Uh, but we're
Mhm.
not going to get to 100%. That is an unrealistic number. So as long as we are trying our best, we strive for progress, but perfection will always elude us, I think, at least in this realm. And that's normal. That's come to be expected. When it comes to peer support programs, I really want to hit on one last topic before we wrap up today's show. It's been such an insightful, with some good points that you've made. I really want to hit on inclusivity and diversity, ensuring accessibility and support for all first responders. How does inclusivity and diversity play a role? Is it key? Is it not key? Is it something that we need to be considering as we, establish a peer support program? Because I know that all first responders experience mental health challenges at the same time, like we mentioned, and some of them are tailored for their agencies, which you've also kind of brought up. We have key factors and key parts of the framework, but we also have, regional or things that might be department or agency specific. But for you, what have you seen as far as inclusivity, diversity, and its importance in a peer support program?
So, um, our peer support team here is somewhat limited by the number of people who are interested in performing in that role. To my knowledge, we have encouraged certain people who looked like they were doing an amazing job of assisting their peers and communicating with them, even though they weren't on the peer support team. And those were folks um, that I think we leaned on and said, hey, we would this would be a good place for you to assist your peers. I am as much of a member as I am of our peer support team. I'm a captain in my department, and in my department, large teams are led by commanders. And in terms of choosing those people through a process, our commander Thomas Watson is responsible for that. And the impression that I have so far of the peer support team members that we've had over the years is that he's done quite a good job with that, and I'm very pleased with that. We do have a much more diverse work group here at Williamson County EMS than we did when I started 19 years ago, which I think is a credit to uh, our educational institutions in the area who have also made that an important aspect of their recruiting. Um, but I cannot say that our team is diverse. I can speak to the importance uh, of diversity when it comes to counseling because that's my current area of study, and it is massively important. for the same reason that I think that our paramedics would rather talk to a group that specializes, a group of counselors that specializes in dealing with people just like us. And I think that uh, it can be easier to establish rapport with people who look like you or perhaps share the same faith values, or whatever it is, the same occupation. And so having that, if you're able to, I think that that there can be extraordinary benefit to that. I know it's proven in counseling, and certainly the awareness of it is multicultural awareness is an essential tenet of learning to become a counselor in this day and age. However, the size of our department, I think, limits how much of that we can insist on. However, I think it's something that we could certainly work towards more of in the future, and having a more diverse group of folks in our peer support team. Can't hurt,
And that's
might very well be extremely helpful.
yeah, it can never hurt, and you are obviously always limited by your workforce, but I do think, from what I've heard, from what you've described, Williamson County EMS has a very inclusive peer support program, meaning that, hey, anybody can activate it if they so choose. And so having
Yes.
that and fostering an environment like that, showing that, hey, everybody is the same. Everybody is human. Everybody can feel emotions, and it's okay. And we all process these things differently. So, hey, if you need, guidance or support in navigating these emotions or these feelings or intrusive thoughts, whatever it may be, you're open. The department's open to it. There's no repercussions, which I think is extremely, extremely important as we, have talked about organizational culture. So I really loved all of the thoughts and just the ideas that you shared and just your own experiences and kind of what you and Williamson County have done and grown with. And I think it hopefully can give some of our listeners and viewers some guidance as they look to either take advantage of their own peer support, maybe look at elevating themselves into that role. Like you mentioned, you typically find these people that are kind of a more caring. They're kind of, the station mom or dad, however you want to kind of look at that. I kind of call them silent leaders because that's really what they are. They're silent leaders, silent mentors. But fostering that growth and identifying that and then giving them the opportunity, I think, is extremely, extremely important. Dan, do you have any important top or key points that you want to kind of leave our viewers with as we kind of wrap up the show today?
Sure. I would say that for those folks who do not have some sort of peer support team, that it's something that should be absolutely essential. Do you carry a trauma bag on your ambulance? You should probably have a peer support team too. Um, and again, what that peer support team depends on, what that's comprised of depends on your resources, your area. But really, all that you need to start it is to have one person in your department who can communicate well with their peers, can hold on to information that they know is very personal and very private, um, and have some sense of connection to the outside world and what's available to those folks for assistance. And those people should take the mantle in their department and make this something that uh, that can come to fruition, because there are lots of people doing it. There are plenty of templates of how to do it. And like we talked about at the outset, it's something that's free. It just takes people who care. And if you're on an ambulance or you work in a fire department or you're a police officer, we already know that you care about people. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing the job. And chances are you care just as much or more about your peers. And so this is this is truly something that we should all have in our organizations. And then I would maybe maybe ask your listeners to consider something. I'm eligible to retire in less than 2 years, and I'm looking forward to having a different career when I retire from here as a counselor. And I will say that if you are fortunate enough to have completed a bachelor's degree and you're interested in mental health and providing a service to your peers, we're going to need a heck of a lot of people who are going to be willing to do this kind of work. And who better to do that work than our peers, the people that we see every day, our partners in uniform, our families in uniform. We should be the ones who are able to take care of ourselves, but to do so really requires a little extra education. And I will say sometimes it feels like a heck of a lot of extra education, but I have 4 semesters
Rewarding
left.
though.
It's Yeah, it's been an incredible experience so far, but it's something that I strongly recommend if you're ready to move on from whatever career that you have in public safety, and you still want to have some connection to your brothers and sisters in this amazing line of work that we've been able to participate in. This is one way that you can do it and really provide a level of assistance for your peers that you probably did for the public. So
I love that
go out and
challenge,
get a
Dan.
go out and work in mental health, but do it for your own folks.
And we're going to need a lot more of them. So that is a really good challenge, and I know several people actually that are going through, and achieving that right now, whether they be a nurse going for their NP of psychology or firefighters that are going after their counseling degrees. It is a challenge, but it is sorely, sorely needed. And it gives you an opportunity to, like you mentioned, stay in contact with your community and really give back. There's no higher calling than, fulfilling your term of service and then turn around and helping others get to the finish line too, I would imagine. And I commend you for setting that example, Dan. And by all means, please let me know. I'll definitely continue to follow your progress and support it any way I can, because, we do need more people out there, and there is nobody coming in to save us. And when you talk about these type of counselors, there are a lot of first responder trauma counselors out there, but they are not from the same cloth. They are not us. They did not serve in service. And so there still is a gap there. And so it is sorely, sorely, sorely needed. So I really appreciate your time, Dan, your thoughts, your insight, this just critical conversation, discussion that we had. It's all been very enlightening. And hopefully those of you out there, the challenge is also, it only takes one person to start this and get this going. It doesn't take money. It takes time, energy, and passion. And, at least for me, there's no higher calling than to be an impact and create an impact for your fellow first responder, your fellow partner, your fellow firefighter, police officer, whatever it may be, your partner. So with that, thank you all. I want to appreciate our viewers for tuning in today for this episode of Critical Conversations podcast, as we kind of broke down just peer support and some of the ideas behind it and how to set up within your agency, and just some of the consideration points that you should have, whether you have a peer support program or you are looking into a peer support program or you're looking to develop one. I think you could all gain some valuable insights. Also, just be sure to go check out Dan. He's on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and just give some Williamson County EMS love for all the stuff that they're doing and being progressive towards mental health and their employees and staff, and setting an example for the rest of us as first responders. And with that, I hope you all have a great night. Stay strong, stay safe, and mind the front line. To our dedicated listeners, thank you again for joining us on this critical journey. Remember, the Critical Conversations podcast is a steadfast resource for police, fire, EMS, allied healthcare workers, dispatchers, air medical, and military personnel, along with their families. Your support makes the impact of these conversations resonate even further. If you found today's discussion enlightening and want to stay connected with our ongoing mission, please be sure to subscribe to the Critical Conversations podcast. You can find us via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and the Mind the Frontline website. Your subscription ensures that you will never miss an episode, and it's a powerful way to show your commitment to fostering resilience within the entire first responder community. For more information and additional resources, visit our website at www.mindthefrontline.org. Together, let's continue these critical conversations and build a stronger, more resilient first responder family. We thank you for being a part of the Critical Conversations podcast. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and mind the front line.